Hi everybody, I'm Jordan from Microsoft. I work on our Visual Studio development environment there. Specifically, I'm a product owner for the JavaScript and Typescript editors in Visual Studio, as well as tooling we provide to build apps for Android, iOS, Windows, and Windows Phone using JavaScript, which is what I'm going to talk about today. A little bit about me real quick. So I've been at Microsoft for a couple years. Before that, I've been working in the industry outside of Microsoft for about 14 years as a web developer at all layers of the stack, but really focusing on JavaScript on the client side. So that brought me around to doing developer tooling for client application development. So I'm going to talk to you about today is this new tooling we just put out a preview release for to build for multiple devices using JavaScript, like I said. We did this using tools out in the open source community that we're also working to give back to. And my real goal out of this is to just open up the conversation with all of you around building a modern mobile app tool chain by showing you what we put together, but really focusing on how we built it on top of these tools, talk about the challenges that we faced and we're dealing with, and kind of our next steps around that. And I'm hoping that for takeaways, you might get some kind of a tool you want to put in your own tool belt if you have to do some mobile development. It might be Visual Studio. It might not. It may be one of the tools I'll talk about here. And also, at least to just give you some food for thought about this space, introduce you to it a little bit if you're not familiar with it. So first up, you may not know this today, but with Visual Studio, we've got a JavaScript development story for writing apps for Windows and the web. And we know from talking with a number of developers that you need to do other devices as well, Android and iOS. You want to be able to build for those with largely a shared code base. And we've got our tooling today for Windows. We get great feedback from users about it, that they like the productivity it provides, and we wanted to bring that same functionality to Android and iOS development in this model. But looking at that, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel and make a whole new thing for this. We wanted to really take advantage of what's out there in the community, see what's out there that works really well for this style of hybrid application development already, and see what we could use there, how we could give back to that and help grow that space. So on the road here, we eventually landed, after looking at a number of options, on the Apache Cordova project. So if you're not familiar with this, Apache Cordova is the open source project on which Adobe's PhoneGap is built. And the way these tools both work is that they let you write native applications for these devices, plus many others, in pure HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And there are a set of tools that will package up those apps, wrap it into a web view or web browser type of control in that application, and then let you get at native device capabilities through a set of these plugins, JavaScript plugins. And you can also use the plugins to normalize APIs across the devices, because not every device has the same DOM, not every device exposes the same sets of things. So you can use this plugin model to work with that. So this is a preview we released back at the start of the month, and actually a little bit later today we're putting out an update of it to address some top issues that we've heard about from customers. It's an early look at where we're going with this. It's not our final release quality. It's more of a thing just to get people looking at it, giving us feedback, see if they find it useful, just kind of start iterating on it. Like I mentioned, built on Cordova, we're built on a number of other open source tools here as well. So there's also the Cordova CLI, which is a node-based command line interface to Cordova that you can go in and npm install the Cordova CLI and get it locally. You can do create, build, run, emulate your applications through that interface. We also have Node in the mix. Since Cordova CLI uses Node, we're also doing the core of our build functionality as a Node script, and I'll show you a little bit of that. On top of that, NPM we use for dynamic acquisition of the tool chain when users first build to bring down Cordova, help bring plugins in from the repo that they have for Cordova plugins. And there's also this thing called Apache Ripple that I'm going to show you. This is an extension to Google Chrome that lets you do local development in the browser, kind of get you maybe 80% of the way there in your development when you're first getting up and going to lay out your UI, get it looking nice before you have to jump over to an emulator or a device. So we use that as well and take a hard dependency on having Chrome to support that. So along with using open source, we also make sure we're being a good citizen here, so we're helping to contribute back to these projects. So far we've already been contributing some to the core of Cordova, and the Cordova CLI worked on a new contacts player, added to the existing contacts plugin some new functionality for like a native contact picker across all the devices, and helped build out Web SQL and IndexedDB plugins so that you can work with the API of your choice for data access without having to worry about necessarily which device has that, which device has this, and then made a number of other plugin fixes across the board. And we did all this with the help of a team we have called Microsoft OpenTech. So that I'm going to go ahead and jump over and show you some of this. Our first example here, we'll just start it running over in RPL. This first example is a quintessential to-do example. It's built using Angular. If you look at the project structure, it's going to be very similar to other client application projects you might build. The only thing unique with Cordova is there's this res folder, and in there you've got things for managing your icons and like splash screens for your mobile application. There's also a config.xml file there that is a place for the central config settings that can affect the way the apps get built out on all the other platforms. So here's our application running. I can add a to-do, I can clear a to-do. I've also extended this demo here to attach into native device capabilities with a video button there. I can't use it in RPL because it doesn't emulate the video, but I'll jump over to an emulator in a moment. We can talk about that. But real quick, this RPL extension lets you do some things to simulate capabilities you may not have on your local device. You could simulate geolocation type of stuff here, change your device and orientation. So again, this can be good for getting you up and running initially. Get the app to a certain point before you then want to go on to an emulator or device to really tailor it. So now we'll go over to the Android emulator. And while this is running, I'll talk about how this is building right now, what's going on. So you can look at our output window, and you'll see some things going by as this build script is running. Again, this is a node-based build experience we've got. We're using Cordova from the Cordova CLI and running through a number of steps in here to manage the main part of the build. So we take the files the way you've got them structured in Visual Studio, package them up, put the layout on disk the way that the Cordova CLI expects them, pull down the right platform support, plugins, and then pass it on to the Cordova CLI to do the build, package the app, and then it's going to make, like the APK in this case, get it back to us, and then use Cordova CLI again to deploy out to the device. So you can see a message here about the deploy starting. I'll switch over to the Android emulator, and we can watch that firing up. So another thing that's happening right now, see how the windows will lay out for us here, is that we also want to hook up our diagnostics tools we have for DOM exploring, the JS console, debug experience in Visual Studio over to the emulator. This would also happen if I were working on a tethered USB device. I could deploy to the device, get these diagnostic tools hooked up to the device. This may be something you've seen done with Chrome, where you can hook up to like an Android device. We're using the same mechanism that Chrome uses here. So, for example, this is going through the Chrome remote debugging protocol to establish the communication back and forth to get the DOM Explorer working. So I can go through and pick out items on our page, and it's looking over the live DOM of the app. I can inspect an element. And if I were running on a device right now, and I was in this inspect element mode, I'd actually be able to hold that up, push on an element on my screen, and it'll select it back in the DOM Explorer in Visual Studio. We've also got the console, so I could look at how this is writing out to local storage and explore that. In this case, the video button, I've cleverly hidden a bug where you can see here there's something wrong with our capture video function. I can find my line number and go there. And so it makes sense it's somewhere in this line because there's capture video. So I can set a breakpoint, come and try that action again, and then the breakpoint, it'll get hit back in Visual Studio, and you can work through and troubleshoot that. It takes a little bit of a moment for the connection. Now if we look through here, we can explore and see that the navigator object is okay. Device looks like it's okay, but obviously there's something wrong with capture video, so you could explore through and either use this window to browse down and figure out how I get to that and realize I might be using the API the wrong way. Or at coding time, I could have used our IntelliSense feature to work through and get to capture and help remind me of how the API works. So again, there's capture video. So I'll hit run with that. So we'll reload that change back into the emulator. So I'm showing you JavaScript right now, but we also have support for Typescript is another thing you could use if you know the language and you like to work with it. We've got templates for both JavaScript and TypeScript that we provide that'll give you a default IntelliSense autocomplete story for these standard libraries and plugins you might want to use. So another thing that's going on here for how we're going to set up the diagnostics tools that I can talk to is that through Chrome, you can actually attach to a remote debugging port to set up those diagnostic tools. With Android, you need to take an extra step and use this tool called the Android Debug Bridge that we're using behind the scenes that lets us get at the app running on the device attached to a remote debugging port opened by that app, then establish the connection, and that's how we do the back and forth with the debugging protocol. So here our app is loading, and I should be able to click the video button. And this is just a mock video capture that they do in the Android emulator. That'll come up here, and you'll see the bouncing box. And so you can take a video of it and use that to test out video functionality. For the last part of the demo, I'll show you how we handle the iOS build. I'm going to go over to an iPhone simulator. Now, some of you, if you've done some development, like with Cordova before, or PhoneGap, you're probably thinking about you need to have a Mac to do that build. You can see I'm running on a MacBook here. We have to, oh no, don't break on me. Let me just undo in case I did something surprising. So the way we handle this is that over on a Mac that you might have in the office, or in this case I'm running in Parallels, I've got them side by side with my Mac. Open up in the terminal, and I've downloaded from NPM, we've got a package for a remote build agent. So this runs on here watching for requests to perform a build. So Visual Studio, unless I've got an error back there again, unfortunately I guess I won't be able to demonstrate that one, Visual Studio would make a request here, send the files over, and then that same form of that same node build script will run, do the build on the Mac, using Cordova there, create the application package from for an iOS app, and then run it in the simulator. Or if we were deploying to a local device, it would also send that back over, and then from Visual Studio I can work through iTunes to install that package onto an iPad or an iPhone. So I just showed you a quick demo there of how we've got Android and iOS support to simulators with Ripple, their emulators that they provide, and how we make that work. We've also got support for Windows and Windows Phone devices. I don't have time today to show you those, but that's in there as well. So now you've seen a little bit of where we're at. Let me talk a bit about where we're going and some of the challenges that we have to deal with. Some of these are of our own creation. So first, for example, the building Windows HTML apps. The security model is such that a number of popular JavaScript libraries don't just work when you pull them in. If I tried to run this app just now against Windows, I'd actually get a security error right away. And we don't really provide we don't provide official guidance or samples to developers on how to work around that, how to deal with that. So we're working to see what we can put together there that at the same time won't compromise the security model, but will make that easier so you can work with the frameworks you know and want to use. The Cordova platform support we have for Windows and Windows Phone isn't as good as we'd like it to be. A chunk of our contributions that we did were to help bring that up to snuff, but there's still more we need to do in that space to make those as really good targets from the Cordova tooling. And then we've also got the debugging experience against Windows Phone is rough right now. We don't hook those diagnostic tools up at all. We want to see if there's something we make that better somehow. We're talking about a little of where we go next with the tooling. Along with Windows Phone, we want to be able to hook up the iOS diagnostics tools. We want to find a way. We don't have that same tool chain where I can use something like ADB to connect to this and communicate with the app running in iOS. So we want to figure out how can we get that going so you can get the same set of tools in VS for the DOM Explorer, debugging against all these devices. The emulator workflow, you might have seen how it's a little slow there going on the Android emulator, and you have to bounce between different emulators like phone and iOS. We want to see if there's a way we can streamline that workflow and make it a little more comfortable. So right now it can just be a bit of a slow, clunky process. Another challenge we've got is around keeping up with the really rapid release cadence of open source software. Each of these projects is versioning independently, and we want to make sure that we can, when we have to ship a release of the product, it's around a set of these things that's really robust, set of all these pieces working well together. And we've had some challenges of when we first were putting this together, for example, working with Ant, a new version of it bumped, and it's used as part of the Android SDK to build. We weren't prepared for that, and it took us out for a few days in our testing efforts because the system just wasn't ready for this some change in Ant that took us out. And now we're faced with the Apache Cordova project has just bumped a version, and we need to see when do we roll that out to users, what are the new bugs we have to deal with around it, and prepare for those. That's a space we need to keep working on. And finally, a couple other challenges that, again, these ones here are a little less in our control, a little more external factors, but you need to use a Mac right now to build for iOS devices. We have some users that either can't or don't want to use a Mac for this, so we need to have an answer to them how we could support that. And then in the enterprise chunk of enterprise customers, some of them aren't very comfortable with open source. They have concerns around security or really getting support of this combination of things. So we need to work and find out how we can alleviate some of those concerns, help them out with that. So I'm going to end now, just talk through a few ideas I had as I've been working through these on ways that maybe we all could help out the general cross-platform dev community through some different open source projects. So the first one that might be kind of obvious is contributing to one of the projects I mentioned here. The Cordova and Cordova CLI are some places for great opportunities to help out in productivity and helping developers get through some repetitive common tasks. Like dealing with splash screens and icons right now is a bit of a pain because you got different formats for each device, and you can't just create one set of icons and then splash screens that just go across everything. It's a bit of a pain. I also wonder if there's something somebody might be able to do around making it quicker to refresh your changes back into the app. You'll notice I did a full rebuild when I made changes. What if we could somehow have your change get just pushed into the running application and you see it fairly live? You get that rapid kind of iteration process we're used to with tools on the web and just opening our web browser and making quick changes. Building out best practice examples for mobile frameworks or app patterns. I think it'd be kind of cool to see something like the To-Do MVC project that might be around best practices for building out mobile apps. There's some things you got to deal with around the changes in performance on the devices, shorter battery life, their on and off connectivity. I think some best practices might be really interesting to put out there to help developers have a place to go to look at working with a variety of these frameworks. What are good ways to mash them up? I talked about TypeScript briefly as something we support. If you like working with TypeScript, you might have seen TypeScript definition files. These are sort of like header files in C. They define the shapes of APIs you can work with. We provide some to help developers kind of get a nice tooling experience around Cordova plugins. And there's a huge community out on the site called Definitely Typed on GitHub that you could check out. And if you don't see a library you like up there, you might contribute back, create some typings, build something that can help that tooling experience. It's a space that over time we're also looking at how can we help the JavaScript editing in Visual Studio and elsewhere through TypeScript files. And then I mentioned plugins a little bit throughout, but there's a place on Cordova that's a plugin repository. And they've got things like a barcode scanner plugin. That's where the camera media capture API plugins are at. This is a good place to check out. That you might find some things where there are APIs you'd want to like polyfill across these platforms as well. Maybe contribute back to those plugins. And then finally, share your likes, dislikes, wishes, feedback with those projects. Some of the ones I mentioned. Work with these tools. Let people know what you think, and let us know. I'd love to hear if there are scenarios you faced in doing mobile development, if you tried it out yet. If you try out our tools and you've got some ideas, I'd love to hear from you about what you think could be done differently, what you wish some kind of tooling would help you deal with, problems you're facing. So on that, I'll leave you with just a set of links to the stuff I talked about so you can get some more information. My contact info is down there as well. I'll be here the rest of the day, flying out way too early tomorrow, but I'd love to hear from you guys in person or online. And yeah, thanks for your time. I'm hoping I can come back maybe next year or so and give you an update on this. But thanks a lot.